Yeah, I'd agree. The vision people have got of what causes inflation is derived from the idea that there's a money multiplier out there, and the government prints enough base money and hands it over to the banks and they lend that money on, then you'll have inflation with the classic old too much money chasing too few goods. That vision, A, is empirically wrong. That's not how the system works. That would have government money created first and credit money created after. We've had 25 years of good empirical research, which of course economists have ignored because it contradicts their theories, showing it's the other way around. Debt money is created first, credit money precedes the creation of government money. And that means that when Bernanke's throwing that $1 trillion into the system, rather than that leading to $10 trillion of additional credit money creating the inflation people are expecting, that $1 trillion is all that goes in, and people deleveraging actually reduce their level of spending by more than $1 trillion by trying to pay their debt down, and it cancels out what the government's trying to do.
Okay. So in other words, the investment banks are creating debt ahead of the federal banks. Typically, the federal banks create debt, and there's a multiplier effect, and that's the GDP growth. But you're saying is that the investment banks are creating way more debt than even the federal banks, and this has reversed the whole process and caused this debt implosion.
There's two ways we create money in our financial system. One is by the government literally creating money, as they can do, by taking a loan out from the Reserve Bank and then spending the money effectively. Whether they then finance it by bonds is a secondary issue. The government prints $1 trillion worth of notes and hands them over to you. We'll go and buy a few hamburgers with that. So it does actually create spending power. It simultaneously normally creates government debt as well. Of course, the private sector can do exactly the same thing. It can give you a loan and give you money generated by that loans. We have a credit system which creates debt and creates money simultaneously. We have a government system which does the same thing. And the reality is the credit system, the private credit system, far outweighs what the government does in our system right now. So the government's creation of money just recently, we look at Bernanke's own manipulation last year, he increased the level of base money by roughly $800 billion, say roughly $1 trillion. That increased the level of base money in the system from $800 billion to $1.6 trillion. The level of debt money in the system is about 10 to 15 times that. And the level of debt is another factor of that again. So total debt in America is roughly $45 trillion versus a level of government money which went from $800 billion to $1.6 trillion. Now, people think that increase in government money is going to cause inflation. Not when it's leaning against $45 trillion of debt money, which people are trying, which is greater than the money supply, which people are now trying to deleverage from. So I think in that case, the collapse of the private credit system is more likely to be a countervailing force far larger than the government's attempts to inject money inside the system. And certainly what I expect is more sort of at the worst situation, you're going to get a truce between the two. I think overall deleveraging by the private system is likely to swamp whatever the government tries to do in terms of printing money to cause inflation. So my bet is still very heavily with the deflation camp.
Okay, Steve Keen, the G20 is meeting. They're going to try to figure out what's going on with this world financial crisis. There's talk maybe about recalibrating the world currency grid, maybe devaluing the dollar versus other currencies. Is that what you mean by a truce? Would that affect kind of a rebalancing of the system?
I don't think it's going to have a great deal of effect. I think the G20 is irrelevant. What they've done is the grand scale stimulus they've put in has certainly boosted the economy, but it's exactly the same thing that Japan did back when its bubble economy burst. Print large amounts of money, run large fiscal deficits, try to stimulate the economy out of the trouble it's got into through excessive debt without doing anything to reduce the excessive debt. And what that has meant over time is that with the debt level being, as it was in the case of Japan, say, roughly 5 times GDP, when the government began trying to stimulate the economy out of its hole, and government debt was roughly half a year's GDP, government debt is now 2 times GDP, 200% of GDP, and private debt's fallen from about 500% to 450%. So by ignoring the elephant in the room, which is the level of private debt, which was irresponsibly generating financial obligations, not doing anything about it, that is still dragging the Japanese economy down virtually 20 years after they fell into their trap. And we've now joined them, and we're using exactly the same tactic the Japanese had and expecting to have a different outcome. Now, of course, in psychology, doing the same thing again and again, expecting a different outcome is the definition of madness. And I think, unfortunately, though it certainly can attenuate the decline caused by debt, by the deleveraging, it can't stop deleveraging unless you actually directly address the level of debt. So I expect us to be trapped in a stultified economy in the same way Japan has been for the last 20 years, unless we do something drastically different.
Unless drastic action is taken. What do you mean by drastic action?
We need to abolish large bits of the debt. The private debt should never have been extended to the subprimes and many other people in the first place. We should write the debt off, bankrupt the banks, nationalise the financial system, and start it all over again. We need a 21st century jubilee.
Okay, so debt cancellation or debt repudiation or debt jubilee is what's needed to fix the situation. Otherwise, we're going into a worse than a depression scenario.
Yep, a never-ending depression. If we don't get rid of the debt, which should never have been extended in the first place, if we keep the parasitic banking sector alive, the economy will die. We have to kill the parasites and give a chance for the real economy to thrive once more and stop these financial doing what they did this time around ever again.
All right, Steve Keen in Australia. We're going to have to leave it there.
Okay.
But that's going to do it for this edition of On the Edge. Max Keiser saying thank you to Stacey Herbert and Steve Keen. Until next week. Oh, if you want to send us an email, send it to ontheedge@presstv.com. That's ontheedge@presstv.com. Until next week. Bye, y'all.